Section 32 of Library Essays, papers related to the work of public libraries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. Library Essays, papers related to the work of public libraries by Arthur Elmore Bostwick. Popularizing Music Through the Library, Part 1. The purchase of music by a public library is justified by the assumption that its use is to be somewhat analogous to that of printed speech. The analogy is, in fact, somewhat closer than most persons realize, and its consideration reveals some mistaken ideas about the use of music in a library, and may give rise to suggestions for the improvement of that use. A page of music, like a page of written language, is a record of something whose primary expression is obtained through sound. Anyone who understands the notation in either case may reproduce the sounds. In one case, this is reading aloud. In the other, it is a performance of the music. In the case of the music, the sounds may be made with the voice, or with an instrument, or with one or several of both at once. But this is only an apparent complication and does not affect the principle. The reader, of course, may learn the language, or the music, by heart, and then dispense with the written record. In practice, there are important differences between the treatment of records of speech and music. As sound is readily imagined as well as actually produced, both speech and music may be enjoyed by a reader without making a sound. If the reader of a book cannot do this, he is not regarded as at all skilled. Most of us, I think, do not consider that a person knows completely how to read when he is not able to read to himself, but finds it necessary to make the actual sounds of speech, whether loudly or only under his breath. In the case of music, however, only the skilled musician, as a general thing, is able to read a page of music to himself, as he would read a page of written language. This is especially the case with instrumental music, and with music where there are several parts. An accomplished musician, however, may run over an orchestral score and hear the performance in his mind, with the quality of each instrument brought out, the harmonies and the shading of intensity. We may go a step further as a matter of curious interest. Language is not necessarily connected with sounds at all. A deaf mute, who has never heard a sound and is incapable of understanding what sound is, may nevertheless learn to read. He is, however, unable to appreciate a page of written music, and I do not know how it would be possible to explain to him what it is like, except the rhythm of it, which may be made to appeal to the senses of sight and touch, as well as to that of sound. In general, however, the reader of music must at least imagine the sounds represented by the notation before him. This is not the case with the reader of speech. Anyone who can read fast and well enough may, like the deaf mute, understand what he reads without even imagining the sound of the words. One may even read so fast that the mere speed forbids any thought of the corresponding oral language. Skilled readers may take in a sentence, a paragraph, almost a page at a glance. This is the sole point of difference between reading language and reading music, and it does not greatly concern us here because all that it practically affects is the speed of appreciation. Something that is of greater importance is the difference of purpose usually found between those who read words and those who read musical notes. When we say of a child that he is studying music, we usually mean that he is learning how to sing or to play on some instrument with a special view of being able to perform before some kind of audience. A music teacher, in like manner, is one who teaches his pupils how to play on the piano or the violin, or how to sing. But when we teach a child to read, we are not primarily concerned with his future ability to read aloud or to recite so as to give pleasure to an audience. What we are thinking of is his ability to read rapidly to himself, so as to understand what is in books. Looked at in the same way, the main thing in musical instruction would be to teach rapid sight reading, so that the reader should get the ability to become acquainted with as large a number of musical masterpieces as possible. One learns to talk by talking. One learns to read by reading. And the same is true of reading music. And as the omnivorous reader of books always wants to express his own thoughts in writing, so the omnivorous reader of music will want to compose. Neither the one nor the other may produce anything great, but the effort will aid in mental development. As a matter of fact, the child begins to put his thoughts into words before he knows how to read. He is encouraged to do so. No mother ever tried to stop her baby from learning to talk because its first efforts were feeble, halting, and unintelligible. How differently we treat the child's attempts at musical expression. For that is the explanation of many of the crude baby noises that we hear. As the child grows, its expression in this direction is discouraged, and seldom is any effort made at encouragement or development. Is it not a wonder that anyone succeeds in composing original music? How many great poets or novelists should we have if every baby were discouraged in its efforts to express itself in words? If it were never taught to talk and never to read? By the time we librarians are able to exert an influence on the reader, this period is past, but it is still possible to do something. Our first job is to disabuse the public of the idea that enjoyment of music has necessarily something to do with mastering the technique of some musical instrument. The phonograph has done good work in removing this impression, but we should never be content with the phonograph any more than we should consent to do away with all printed books and rely wholly on works read aloud on the Victrola. There will always be pleasure and profit in doing one's own reading, whether in speech or in music. One must understand musical notation, of course, just as one must know the notation of written speech before he can read books. He must also understand a little of some instrument, preferably the piano, though only enough for sight reading, his object being to understand and appreciate the music himself, not necessarily to bring understanding and appreciation to others. I think I have gone far enough along this train of thought to show the principle on which I should select the music for a public library collection. I should form such a collection in precisely the same way as my collection of books. A very large proportion of the books in a public library are properly intended for those who will read them for their own delectation, enjoying and appreciating and profiting personally by what they read. A much smaller proportion are books for study and research. A still smaller number are dramatic or other selections intended principally for recitation or declamation. So in selecting my music, I would acquire chiefly selections for reading. I do not mean elementary reading. One does not limit his language books to primers. I should buy works of all grades of difficulty, but I should always have in mind the primary use of these for sight reading. Comparatively few would be pieces written solely for display, to dazzle the hearer or to show off technique. Few would be pieces whose interest is chiefly historical or academic. I do not say that I should exclude either of these kinds, but I certainly should not include them in greater degree than I should include analogous material in buying ordinary books. Bear in mind, also, that I am speaking of an ordinary public library, of average size, not that of a university library, nor that of a music school, nor a public library so large that it may properly have some of the functions of both of these. Just as it is a conspicuous duty of the library to raise and maintain the level of literary taste in its community, and to keep this fact in mind in the selection of its books, so it is the business of its musical collection to raise and maintain the level of musical taste. My own opinion, which some may regard as heretical, is that taste cannot be cultivated, in literature or art or music, to any considerable extent by study. The study of these things must have to do largely with history and technique, and while a knowledge of these is desirable, it cannot affect taste, though we may imagine that it does. We may reduce this matter to its lowest terms by thinking for a moment of something that depends on the uncomplicated action of an elementary sense, physical taste. If one does not like an olive when he eats one for the first time, that judgment cannot be reversed by studying the history of olive culture. If he dislikes cheese, it will be useless to take him into a cheese factory and explain to him or teach him the technical processes of manufacture. The only way to make him change his mind is to induce him to keep on eating olives, when one of two things will take place. Either his dislike of olives will be confirmed, or it will disappear. As most people like olives when they become accustomed to the taste, the latter result is to be expected. Now, suppose that someone does not care for Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. My contention is that he cannot be made to like it by studying the history of music, or that of this particular selection, nor by analyzing its structure, that he may be led to do it by listening to it repeatedly. As persons familiar with good music do generally enjoy this piece, it is probable that this result will follow. I know that I must now justify this comparison. When I make it, I am accustomed to indignant protest on the part of some of my students. Is it not unworthy to compare the music of the Moonlight Sonata to a mere physical sensation like the taste of an olive? Only as it may be considered unworthy to compare the great and the small, the complex and the simple. Both the taste of the olive and the sound of the sonata have a physical origin and impress the brain through the agency of the sense organs. And, as a matter of fact, I doubt whether the sensation of the music is much more complicated than that of the taste. We know that an acoustic sensation is a unit. When a chorus is singing with orchestral accompaniment, the result is not 100 sound waves, but 1. It strikes the eardrum as a unit, and that vibrates as a unit, so that the impression on the brain about whose mechanism we are ignorant must also be a unit. The popularity of the phonograph enables us to illustrate this familiarly. Examine with a microscope a record of a complicated musical performance, with many voices and many different kinds of instruments, and you will find a single wavy line. When the needle causes the disc to vibrate by following this line, it vibrates as a unit, just as the eardrum does. There is but one disc, yet its vibration enables us to pick out separately the different voice parts and to recognize the separate quality of the stringed instruments, the woodwinds, and the brasses, with the drums, bells, and what not. When we taste the olive, we get a sort of chemical effect. We do not know what happens as definitely as we do in the case of a musical sound, but the various atoms, each vibrating in its own way, act upon the taste buds of the tongue so that a sensation is transmitted to the brain, transmitted as a unit, just as the sound is. I want to be fair, so I will acknowledge that instead of comparing a single sensation of taste to a sequence of sounds, I should have likened it to a musical chord. To get a taste analogy with a sonata, we should have to use a sequence of taste sensations, possibly that presented by a course dinner. I submit, however, that this does not affect my argument. Let me repeat my conviction, then, that art is primarily a matter of the heart and not of the head, of the feelings and not of the intellect, and that the feelings are trained by personal experience, not by study. One cannot learn to appreciate a poem, or a picture, or a piece of music by examining it historically or structurally, only by experiencing it and others like it again and again, and also by experiencing in life the emotions that the art is intended to arouse. Of course, I do not mean to say that knowledge of history and technique is not interesting and valuable. It is highly interesting to know the recipe for the pie and to watch the cook make it, but this does not affect the taste. Knowledge obtained by study does affect ability to reproduce or create. One must know how the pie is made before he can make one himself. One cannot write a poem or paint a picture or compose a song without preliminary study. This should be understood, but it is outside the pale of our present discussion, which relates to the chief purpose of the music collection in a library and of its chief uses. My contention, to repeat, is that it is related to musical art precisely as the purpose of the book collection is related to the art of literature. Now, the present status of the music collection is precisely what that of the book collection would be in a community where the percentage of literacy was small, where a considerable number of persons did not understand the language of the books, even when spoken or read aloud, where those who knew the language understood it only when spoken or read, and where readers were obliged to read aloud before they could appreciate what they were reading. A community, moreover, where teaching generally meant solely teaching how to recite or read aloud acceptably to others, with only enough ability to read to get the sense of an extract and enable the reader to commit it to memory. A librarian set down with a collection of books in such a community would not be true to his vocation if he did not attempt to better this state of things, while admitting the elements of good that it contained. For instance, the imaginary situation that I have described would be quite comparable with a real appreciation and love of good literature. End of section 32.